Specifically, our nation was conceived upon the notion that the unalienable natural rights given by God to the people were being violated by the British Crown. These rights, as these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were further infringed upon, tensions increased between the two sides of the Atlantic until it reached its boiling point, spilling over into the American Revolution. These colonists believed King George III's rule over them to be disagreeable, repulsive, and unable to be submitted to. As such, they acted upon their beliefs, turning their disapproval into action and ultimately bringing about the change they so ardently sought. This war resulted in the American colonists' liberation from British rule and the start of a new nation. This is the essence of protest. When something, anything in particular, is disagreeable to someone, then that person has the ability to protest against it for the end goal of turning that into something that they believe to be just. Protest is bound to show up at different times across our nation, given that the right to peaceably assemble is part of our Constitution. And if protest is something that we will encounter in our lives, then we must, at the very least, know how to deal with the protests of others, and further, how to ourselves protest against injustice. How can we properly react when we see injustice in the country, and how can we combat those who cause further injustice when our own freedoms and unalienable rights, and the freedoms and unalienable rights of others, are encroached upon? We must know how to react in a manner of propriety and efficacy, and thus, by keeping watch over the injustices of our community and, at a larger scale, our entire country, we properly fulfill our roles as American citizens and honor the American identity. By using certain guidelines, we can judge actions and methods of protest to be just or unjust. In particular, rioting, while by no means a new method, has been a very prominent form of discussion in recent years. According to Cambridge dictionaries, rioting is simply a violent or noisy public gathering. Particularly after the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York City, rioting has resurged in attention in the media. As by the definition, this form of protest typically involves the destruction of property, chaos, and violence as a means by which a group of people attempt to bring about change. Another common means of protest is boycotting. Merriam-Webster.com defines boycotting as to refuse to buy, use, or participate in something as a means of protest. As by the definition, many have used this form of protest to call for change within a particular system. Regardless of their legitimacy, these are just a couple different examples of the types of protests that we see today. However, in American democracy, many forms of protest ignore both the American ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and Christian morals as laid out in the Bible. Protest, in this case, can be defined as a statement or action of disapproval towards something that negatively affects the protester. Protests that defy the commandments of God and disregard the unalienable rights of others are illegitimate, regardless of their end goal or their perceived effectiveness. The ends do not justify the means. Thus, these methods of protest need to be replaced with more righteous and proper means of expressing disapproval and bringing about change. And Americans, with the issues of their community being one of their responsibilities, must conform their methods accordingly. What standards govern good and bad protest, and where do these standards come from? The standards that govern the quality and propriety of a protest outside of the written word of God mostly come from the cultural and national beliefs of a particular country. America, historically, has laid many foundations of their beliefs and ideals that give aid to creating a clear picture of what protest should and shouldn't be. Perhaps one of the biggest ideals of America is the value of the individual. The Declaration of Independence, one of the major documents upon which the United States was founded, states that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While this declaration is specifically talking about its citizens and its government, its principles can apply to alterations outside the institution that is the American government. The Declaration also establishes the sacred rights of each individual man and asserts that these rights must not be encroached upon. Therefore, if protesters seek justice for a cause, then they must employ just tactics to do so. If protesters desire to preserve the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of others, then they must do so in ways that preserve the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of themselves and others. A relevant example of just protest to fight against injustice is in the actions of the revered Martin Luther King Jr. Specifically, his protest against the arrest of Rosa Parks in 1955 gives a clear example of just protest and its effectiveness. Martin Luther King Jr. protested directly against those oppressing him and his people by refusing to give them further service. By rallying the protest against the bus system, the perpetrator of the injustice that they sought to amend, they refused service, consequently bringing about awareness and change. He knew that corruption, even at this level, could be fought while still upholding American ideals. As such, he did not call for riots, nor did he infringe on the God-given rights of others. Instead, he fought this institutionalized injustice, attacking the institution directly by making jabs at it, rather than the American citizens who may fall under it. His sit-ins and boycotts proved a point without infringing upon the rights of others. Actions like these have made Martin Luther King Jr. one of the most widely respected men in all of American history. However, unjust protests that do violate the rights of others are to be condemned. A very prominent method of protesting that does exactly that is rioting. The very nature of rioting involves violence. It may harm property, public or private, and possibly even your fellow human beings. In Ferguson, Missouri, the rioters, seeing violence and upheaval as the best and only solution to their perceived problem, used these methods of protest in order to express their disapproval towards the shooting of Michael Brown and the consequent exoneration of all charges against the officer who shot him. They destroyed both private and public property and assaulted police officers in an attempt to express their rage towards a justice system that they, in fact, believed to be unjust. However, even if their perception of the case was true, and Michael Brown was unjustly murdered, these protests were illegitimate, regardless of the attention that they brought to their plight, due to their blatant disregard of the rights of other Americans. A quote that is often used to support rioting is stated by Martin Luther King Jr. himself. He states that a riot is the language of the unheard. People often interpret this quote to mean that Martin Luther King Jr. approved of riots in the case when nobody would listen to that specific group of protesters. However, King making a recognition of the fact that rioters are unheard does not at all mean he is condoning or justifying their methodology. Rather, he is recognizing that the riots are the potential consequence of a particular institution to not give enough attention to the plight of a particular group of people. And though King is conceding that the institution, in this case the American government, has not given enough attention to the plight of the black race and has deliberately privileged the white race over the black race, he still does not at all condone their methodology. He employed tactics such as sit-ins, marches, and boycotts, all nonviolent, peaceful methods that justly upheld the rights of all citizens. King, historically, made it extremely clear about his beliefs that nonviolent protest is not only the most just, but also the most effective. The issues of our country are not irrelevant, and the means by which we combat them certainly aren't either. The nation that we live in, that we call our home, has its roots firmly grounded in the resistance to injustice. Our duties as American citizens is to fight against the injustices that so plague our nation. And yet, we must defend the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in ways that coincide with justice and rejoice with the truth. You all have seen what the media has displayed. Heinous crimes are committed by institutions on a daily basis. People are unjustly oppressed, ground into submission, and sometimes even murdered by evil authorities. These riots, even though they were condemned previously, are all for the purpose of purging this injustice from our beloved nation. And yet, we, as upholders of the American ideals and proud bearers of the American name, are called to fight the injustices in our community and, at a larger scale, our entire country. The call to abolish this corruption is of great magnitude, but it will ultimately be illegitimate if we employ unjust tactics to do so. And thus, by advocating for protests that deem every citizen's life valuable and deem that certain sacred rights ordained by God shall never be broken, we can do that much more to turn this country into what our Pledge of Allegiance has called it to be: one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.